Hello, my friends. Nice to see you all. Welcome back. And we're going to talk today about the final plank, as it were, in the political makeup of Ireland prior to the revolution, in the shape, as you can see, that of Irish Unionism, particularly Ulster Unionism. Because what we have really is a process now in this period where All Ireland Unionism becomes increasingly focused on Ulster. And that's very understandable because, of course, Ulster has a very different character in many ways from the rest of Ireland, and particularly from the other three provinces of Munster, Leinster and Connaught. One obvious way, of course, in which it's different is in terms of religion. And famously, of course, in the decades prior to the revolution, the other three provinces put together had a Protestant population of around 9%. So very, very small. In Ulster, as you can see, it's 55%. So 55% of the population of Ulster were Protestant. And, you know, it's important to realise, and there's a nice map there just showing you so where they are particularly concentrated. You'll notice they're concentrated particularly in East Ulster, which is going to be important later on. What's very important to realise about religion and politics in Ireland is it's only very late that we get this kind of duality, this polarisation between Protestants and Catholics. That only occurs really in the latter part of the 19th century. So really when you get to 1860, which I suppose is the big moment, is when you get the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. See, prior to then you'd had Presbyterians, you'd had nonconformists, you'd had Catholics, and you'd had the Church of Ireland establishment. So that there'd been more than three, it's more been a triangle really. And, you know, Presbyterians themselves suffered from the penal laws, certainly not as badly as Catholics did, but they themselves were not, as it were, part of the elite. But once you disestablish the Church of Ireland now, you see, I say the late 19th century, these various brands of Protestantism, as it were, drawing together. And then you get, as I say, this more straightforward duality, Catholic and Protestant. But up until then, it's certainly not that simple at all. So the religious demographics are very obvious and very important when you talk about why this renewed focus on Ulster. And a second thing to talk about, I suppose, that distinguishes Ulster not just within Irish Unionism, but essentially from the rest of Ireland, of course, is its economy. Parts of Ulster, and we're talking particularly East Ulster here, were far more prosperous than the rest of Ireland. And I'll show you here, obviously, the economic prosperity you have is fired particularly by the incredible, remarkable rise of Belfast as a city. You know, by the turn of the century, Belfast was the most important industrial and financial centre in all of Ireland. So Dublin still remains, as it were, the administrative and ceremonial capital of Ireland, certainly, but Belfast is the powerhouse of the Irish economy in the decade or so prior to the revolution. And to give you some figures in terms of this, by 1907, 2/3 of all industrial exports originated in the Belfast region. 2/3, that's incredible. Belfast banks, for example, held over 50% of all deposits in Ireland were held in Belfast banks, and over 80% of all business credit balances. So if you've got a business in Ireland, Belfast banks are the place you want to put it. Incredible. And I say, you see here with the population particularly this process of urbanisation. People are drawn now to this city now to work, and population growth rockets. As you can see, incredible. 75,000 people in Belfast in 1841. That had risen to 387,000 by 1911. Isn't that remarkable? 50 years. It's a huge rise of this. So it's a very, very powerful, very confident city. And, you know, in that census of 1911, you can see it. And I suppose it is arguable that Belfast has now become the largest city in Ireland. You know, it depends how you measure this. Obviously, the Dublin metropolis is quite big, but where you draw the boundaries. But it certainly is, you know, close to being, if not the largest city in Ireland. That's where the focus is. That's where the money is. That's where the energy is. The economic dynamism is all happening in this small part of the northeast. again, why this is the case? Well, if you've ever been to Belfast and you've seen Belfast Harbour, it does have extraordinary attributes as a harbour. It's just a fluke, really. And, of course, it's facing the right way in the sense it's facing Britain. And, leads to this flourishing maritime economy. And that's really the basis now. Shipbuilding, particularly, is going to be the basis of much of this, which just grows and grows in terms of its scale, in terms of its technology in the 1850s. And around it grow up lots of other attendant industries, engineering and so on. So they come to dominate. This big, heavy industry now comes to dominate East Ulster in the 50 years prior to the Revolution. And I'll give you, it's no better shown here, I suppose. When you look in 1858, we have Edward Harland arriving in Belfast, taking over a small yard in the east of the city, and along with Gustav Wolff, another entrepreneur, built one of the most profitable, one of the most innovative shipyards in the world in the shape of Harland and Wolff. And culminates, of course, in 1909 with the launch of these huge liners, these three liners now, the Olympic, the Britannic and the Titanic. These huge, which are just wonders of the modern world. And so right in the cusp of our revolution, they really have reached the kind of apex, as it were, of this incredible economic and sort of technological innovation and prosperity. Now, what this is going to lead to, as it were, politically, is the success of Belfast, leads this new business elite of East Ulster to conclude that Belfast prosperity is wholly reliant on Ireland remaining part of the British world and part of the British imperial world now. That's where they're selling their ships. Obviously, Britain has this worldwide empire. Now, you need a hell of a lot of ships for an empire that's spread across the globe, and Belfast is supplying them. Any loosening of that connection, they feel, would have disastrous consequences for these industrial achievements. And here's a wonderful cartoon here. This is one of my favourite cartoons. This is a Protestant fear writ large here. You can see. So a statue of John Redmond now in the middle of Belfast. This is what Home Rule would mean. Now, you can see the Protestant Emigration Office in the bottom there. Everyone's leaving now. That's it done. The poorhouse, an annex to the poorhouse. That's what it's going to mean. These are real, genuine fears amongst Protestants. So there is some truth in this, I think. The development that they have with very close links between East Ulster and the northwest of England, the west of Scotland, for example, and Glasgow and so on, and Clydeside, is crucial to the well-being of the Belfast economy. Mainly because, of course, you have a terrible and crippling shortage of coal and iron in Ireland. And you have to bring that stuff in. And that's offset now by this ability to import these raw materials through Glasgow, through Liverpool, and so on. So the resistance to Home Rule in the 19th century, I think it's fair to say, is backed up by genuine fears. That people genuinely believe this is the case. Whether it is the case or isn't, you can argue back and forth whether the Home Rule really is a great threat to this economy. And, in 1886, for example, when all this is happening and the first Home Rule was going through and all this tension, Edward Harland, for example, says that if Home Rule is introduced, he's going to pack up and move his yard now to Glasgow, because this is no good for him at all, no good economically. And again, just show you this. You can see. So I love this. So Ulster is Prosperity Province. There you go. Leinster, Maynooth Province. Maynooth is the big, of course, Catholic seminary there. All these Catholic priests are being led. Poverty Province in Connaught and Land League Province in Munster. So just troublemakers and it's wonderful. But you can see, just look at the labels there. The Home Rule rocks there. The Gulf of Socialism. Great fun. But I say, it does hint at the fact that there is a genuine fear that the economic prosperity, which is miraculous, which is all around people see it everywhere. This is amazing. City's growing, it's booming, it's very proud of itself. That's all going to be threatened now if Home Rule is introduced and you begin to put up barriers between Ireland now and the rest of the British Empire. So I think, to be fair, that's an argument you can, as I say, make. I think the second conclusion they draw, and what kind of comes out of this, is probably going to be something that's far more damaging and, I suppose, darker when we think about Irish identity. And this is a kind of belief that the success of the Ulster economy is down to an Ulster proclivity for hard work and entrepreneurship. This is the old idea of the Protestant work ethic, that it's the Protestant people of Ulster, their culture, their worldview, which has given rise to this success that they've had. Now, this perception is almost wholly false, certainly desperately exaggerated. There's no evidence at all for any kind of higher level of entrepreneurship or skill or whatever in East Ulster, despite all these stereotypes that we always have. Most of the key people, for example, who come, so Harland and Wolff, as examples of this, don't come from Ireland, they come from outside Ireland, and just really benefit enormously from circumstance in that sense. It's also the case, and here's a very important point which really poo-poos that whole idea, is that prosperity in Ulster is very localised, in the sense that it tends to be focused on East Ulster, a small bit of East Ulster as well, around Belfast, the Lagan Valley and so on. Most of Ulster remains overwhelmingly rural. Most of Ulster actually looks just like the other parts of provincial Ireland. It's very, very similar, with vast, 2/3 of the population or something working on the land, which is happening elsewhere. So it doesn't really work, that kind of argument. But I say it's something that's absolutely believed, and particularly believed by many in these East Ulster business elites. Look what we've built. You can kind of see why they think that, along with their own kind of, perhaps bigotry that they may have against Catholic Ireland. But I say it isn't really true. But those East Ulster elites, of course, will play an absolutely crucial role in the anti-Home Rule campaigns of the later 19th century. They will eventually seize control completely of Irish Unionism, and of course will be the elites now who end up taking over the new Northern Ireland when it's created. If you look at the character of some of these people, I see it will no longer be what it has been before, which is, as it were, the landed gentry with big estates down in Munster or Connaught or whatever, who are in charge of Irish Unionism. It will be, tobacco manufacturers, someone like James Craig from East Ulster. They're the people who are absolutely going to be shaping the agenda. But I say the economic fears are what really lies, as I say, behind much of this. There are other fears too, as well, and I'll just show you some of these. Let's see, we've mentioned economic prosperity as well. One of these, of course, and again, you can see how this is all interlinked, but it's this idea of the protection of their religion. I say in the 1860s you get this disestablishment, Irish Protestants moving closely together, and there is a real fear that of the power of the Catholic Church in Ireland under a Home Rule Parliament. That Protestants themselves, who make up about 25% of the population, are going to be swamped by Catholics. That what Irish nationalists essentially want, because they're so incredibly devout, was basically a Catholic kind of theocracy, really. And they're going to be legislated against, discriminated against. Again, part of their folk memories, of course, and just show you here, of your Ulster Protestant comes from the 1641 massacres, which is this terrible set of massacres when Catholics went on the rampage in Ulster and murdered Protestants. You can see, tortured them and killed them in their beds and so on. That's part of the folk memory. I say that's in the mind of your Ulster Protestant, that Catholics themselves are always vengeful, dangerous, backward, anarchic. And again, some examples of this, you can see the massacre at Portadown particularly is one. I mean, it's a dreadful thing. There's a dreadful example of one of these terrible kind of mass killings that you get. But I say, yeah, that's all in the heads, as it were, in the minds of your Ulster Protestant. And the thing about, of course, the Catholic Church is it does very little to reassure Protestants in Ireland. And give you an example of this, leading up to the revolution, we have two papal decrees, one in 1908 and one in 1911. One which bans cross-denominational marriages, or at least what it says is that any children of mixed marriages should be brought up Catholic. That's what you have to do. And also the one in 1911 seems to imply, it doesn't really mean this, but it seems to imply, that's how you can take it, that priests are immune to secular criminal prosecution. That's the big kind of fear now that you have. So unionism has this kind of interlocking set of fears. A backward, priest-ridden Catholic South, which is poor, which, if given home rule, will push on to its real objective, they believe, which is full independence. It will cut off prosperous Ulster from the empire and liberal Protestant secular Britain. And, of course, how they will survive is by taxing the northeast, the prosperous northeast, sucking the life out of the northeast, as it were, economically. So I say these kind of fears, and I'll just show you. I suppose the way to think about this is the kind of debates that you get in Italy between northern and southern Italy. The way those kind of arguments are framed and so on, impoverished south and a prosperous north, and the north itself, it makes all the running, makes all the money, and the south is just a drain. I think if you want to get a handle on it, that's the kind of idea. So, and here we go, the distribution of Protestants, which you can see here, particularly this move towards Ulster, this process, as we call it, of Ulsterization, which is another process we get prior to the revolution. And again, we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. So there's a number of reasons for that. I'll just show you this. Here we go. I see the empire is very prominent here. Here is Carson knocking out Asquith during what we'll talk about, the Home Rule crisis, and the Ulster crisis held up by Churchill, desperately wafted by John Redmond. But that's how they always frame this thing, as the empire and the flag and prosperity. All these things, as I say, are linked together. But I say what happens is they do manage, of course, to defeat Home Rule in 1886 and 1893. But Irish Unionism continues to grow. It continues to change and develop. And I say increasingly becomes focused on the province of Ulster, which I say was where the large proportion of Irish Protestants live. Let me go here. Again, just show you these as we kind of go through. And to give you an example of how this is, unionism is Ulsterizing, as it were. In 1905, we get the creation of an Ulster Unionist Council. So a regional council, as it were, for Unionists in Ulster. You get these kind of nationalist mythologies. This new nationalism we mentioned, particularly in Ulster, is met with a kind of renewed interest in the history and cultural nationalism of Ulster Protestantism, Ulster Scots, for example, typified by the revival of the Orange Order, for example, in this period, and the rejection of Gaelic cultural forms and the language. And this is what we said when we talked about the new nationalism. You get this kind of polarization. It's kind of sad, really, in a way. You get, I say, once you define what Irishness is, you have to define what it isn't. That's what always happens with these when you start making hard lines between identities. And I say the other side itself will almost articulate itself against everything that Irish nationalism represents. So both sides go in this different kind of direction. And just show you some of these are quite fun. Now, I say it is going to Ulsterize, and that's a very important process. Irish Unionism is going to become increasingly Ulster Unionism, let's say. Now, the definitive split in Irish Unionism will not happen until during the Revolution, as we'll see. But there are a number of longer-term developments going on here which precipitate the demise, as it were, of All-Ireland Unionism. One, of course, is something that's happening everywhere across Europe. The old landed elites now are on the wane. Now, this old Victorian class now, which, as it had been the leadership of Irish Unionism for so long, was very well connected. Now, land itself, of course, is not particularly in the 20th century, we get to the late 19th century, that's not where power resides. Power resides now with commerce, with industry, with manufacture. It resides in East Ulster. So you have a general European shift in power, as it were, from landed to industrial capital. And that's something that's affecting Ireland as well. Southern Unionism itself, or All Ireland Unionism we could call it, of course, has a very difficult message, as it were, to sound. It has a very difficult political line to tread, because when you think about it, the threat of home rule to Ireland it means you get a lot of division within the strategy of unionists living in the south. So what I mean by that is, some of them think, well, we're going for outright opposition, as our friends in Ulster are doing. Absolutely no, not. Others are thinking, do you know what? There's only 9% of us here. I think this is inevitable, that we're going to end up under some kind of home rule parliament. So maybe what we need to do is be more constructive and engage with that parliament, win concessions, and then we could maybe shape the nature of home rule to our advantage. We have to go, it's inevitable. So there's always that tension, as it were, that you don't get in Ulster. It's wrong, certainly, though, to judge the relationship between, I'd say, Ulster and Southern Unionism, if you like, as hostile. Because many Southern Unionists will be very keen advocates of what we'll see, the strategy of using Ulster now to resist the passage of the Third Home Rule Bill. And I say, in the age of mass politics now, the thing is, back in the Victorian era, when we're talking about the House of Lords having a veto and so on, and I say these very strongly interconnected elites, yes, the southern landed elite absolutely have access to the corridors of power. Certainly, they have a power that isn't commensurate with their numbers. Certainly, but think about, I say, the age we're moving into. We're moving into the age of mass politics now, where you need numbers now, where more people are getting the vote, where you need mass political appeals now. It's no longer, as I say, in smoke-filled rooms and so on, and in the House of Lords, that these elites are, their power, both economic and political, is crumbling away. So naturally the focus goes to Ulster, where you have 1 million unionists now who are going to be out marching and protesting and voting, particularly to show that they do not want home rule in Ireland. And I think finally, always think rather symbolically, is this, what happens here is in 1921, you get the replacement now of Sir Edward Carson now as the leader of Irish Unionism, with James Craig, who's a Presbyterian. So Carson himself is a Dublin, Church of Ireland, elite, Anglo-Irish lawyer. He's from the old world, as it were. James Craig is born and bred in Belfast. As I say, his father's a tobacco manufacturer. He is, he is absolutely a kind of product of this new East Ulster Presbyterian prosperity. And I think it's very symbolic of, I say, this process now, this sort of shift now northwards, as it were, that you get in the shape of Ulster Unionism. So I think the big takeaway from all this is two real points. Is that while Unionism Ulsterizes in this period, as we've just said, Irish nationalism, you could say, Catholicizes, if you like, or Gaelicizes, if you like. So both of these now, I say, groups that are emerging and are beginning to refine their identities increasingly. And I say all the myths and all the sort of imagery and so on that we all kind of know today very much grows up in reaction to one another. And I say it's absolutely crucial when we think about the revolution, we think about partition and so on going forward. Okay, my friends, so I'll see you all next time when we'll begin to talk about the Ulster crisis itself and the beginnings now of the revolutionary period in 1912. Okay, take care and I'll see you soon.